Hello, this is Mike Swanson. You're listening to the Wall Street Window podcast. Often I talk with guests about the financial markets, but sometimes I talk about guests about all sorts of topics. But what's always in common is I talk with someone who's very interesting, and often I use the show as an excuse to talk with someone I like to talk with anyway and have an interesting conversation. And that's what I did today. I spoke with JP Sottile, who runs the website newsvandal.com. Now, if you have listened to me on the Ceccacelli Effect, often on Tuesdays, he will come on after my segment. But if you don't know who JP is, he's a freelance journalist, a published historian, has been a radio co-host and documentary filmmaker, worked at one time for the PBS NewsHour news desk, and then for C-SPAN and for a television affiliate in the D.C. area. Today he runs newsvandal.com, which is best known for a daily email, goes out every Monday to Friday, and it's one of the few email lists that I open up and look at every single day and actually look forward to doing so. He collates what he sees as some of the most interesting headlines of the day and integrates it with some of the best content he has found that are think pieces and well worth taking your time to take a look at. And he uses a variety of sources from all across the political spectrum to give you a good idea of what's going on everywhere. And we talked about a wide range of topics, talked about the impeachment hearings because both of us have just finished watching much of it, and the geopolitics and how it's changing over the years with the status of the United States and other countries it competes with around the world, including Putin's Russia. And then we talked about this internet surveillance capitalism, as he was calling it, that we live in today and how it's impacting our daily lives and our culture. So after a quick little commercial break, on to JP Sottile.
Go ahead, caller.
Hey, I'm interested in the truth about the JFK assassination.
Right. Well, what do you want to know?
Judy Baker's wild claim, Oswald girlfriend, she knew Ruby and Barry, cancer weapons. Really?
I imagine I could claim I have four wheels. It doesn't make me a wagon, but okay.
Oswald was on the kill team and trying to prevent the murder of John Kennedy. Come on now. Has a real expert on the JFK assassination looked into her claims?
Go to Amazon.com, enter Judith Baker in her own words. You'll get results for a digital copy of a book where Walt Brown utilizes her own words and the known evidence in the case to get at, well, a different perspective, let's say. You can get Judith Barry Baker in her own words from the author himself, signed if you request it, by contacting Dr. Brown at KIASJFK@AOL.com. It's a fun book, and it actually dissects the many, many fantastic claims. Judith Barry Baker in her own words.
Thank you for all the great information.
How you doing today, JP?
Well, today was the first of the impeachment hearings, so I feel like I just came off of the congressional equivalent of the Bataan Death March.
Well, that's sort of. I actually watched a good part of it, and it does. After a couple hours, it seemed to get repetitive. But I gotta say, the testimony, whether the listener, the audience, or whoever wants to think Trump should be impeached or not, I certainly believe that the testimony the two men gave today, Taylor and Kent, was completely credible, and the Republicans really didn't do much to discredit them. I believe, as the acting ambassador, that Taylor has probably lots of records and memos of everything that went on that, the Congress has access to that would be impossible to dispute. And I say that because I've doing work on the Vietnam War, and I've been studying the overthrow of Diem, and there's been these declassified files along the Kennedy stuff, and you see everything's on paper. There's memos being written and cables going back from the ambassador to Washington. They go to the CIA, they go to the State Department, and everything's on paper. So I assumed, and the same is the case here. And that's what got the whistleblower involved. And just one quick comment: the Republican argument against him that Congressman Jordan gave was that okay, you say all this stuff happened, but the aid was still released, so you don't know what you're talking about. But I went back and looked. This is sort of maddening to me because I'm watching this and I'm thinking there's an obvious rebuttal to this. And they're not, no one on the Democrat side or the two witnesses are giving it, and I had to look it up before we talk to make sure I'm correct in thinking this. But the aid was released the day, or the day,
2 days.
2
days after. 2 days after Congress began what turned into this investigation into why the aid was not being released. So
so what the? Okay, that's not an argument.
Came to Congress's attention. There was this story. I was tracking it and doing the rundown. There was this story that was starting to appear a few days before that about some kind of big something going on among the national security establishment about something that had to do with Ukraine, and it kind of popped up in a couple places, but it didn't. There was nothing clear about it. It was starting out in, I think it was like a sidebar thing that happens in like the Morning Hill rundown and something in Politico and whatnot. So I never put anything on the rundown about it. I was just waiting to see what would happen, and then it broke, and then within 48 hours you get the release. And so obviously somebody realized, well, we better do something about this now. And then we now know that within days there was also a scheduled appearance by Zelensky to go on CNN to make the statement that they were looking for, that we're going to open an investigation into this corruption. So, I mean, that's all there. I think, obviously Kent and Taylor, you make a couple good points. One is a guy like Taylor, who finally they got to his biography more solidly at the end, top of his class, number 5 out of, I think, 800 or 900 in West Point, then graduates, decides to go into infantry when, as an officer at the top of his class, could have picked a number of different assignments. He decided to go on the ground and pick up a weapon and fight in Vietnam. I mean, the credentials there are sterling. And there is no doubt that he kept voluminous notes, and that's one thing that we're learning about professional. Now, this was the same thing with former White House counsel Don McGahn, who kept prolific notes of everything that he observed. And now we learned about Bolton, who is the most ironic sort of anti-hero in this whole thing, because it's Bolton who probably would be the most damning witness. I would assume that if Pompeo or Mulvaney were to get up there, they would prevaricate and they would stumble and mishandle most of their defense, but not really say anything of note unless they mistakenly did so. But Bolton, who apparently as his last act was part of that end run, we've got to get that aid out as soon as possible. And now the speculation is the reason that he and Trump parted ways had to do with this Ukraine issue. And Bolton's the guy who said that Giuliani is he's up to some kind of drug deal. And I think it was Michael McFaul, who used to be ambassador, I think, to Russia under the Obama administration, said that that's actually a term of art among diplomatic officials and State Department officials to talk about when they call something a drug deal, it's some kind of off the books, irregular form of diplomacy. So Bolton's got a lot of the goods here too. So whether that's going to happen, because now that's all tied up in court, saying, the same thing with Mulvaney. But, I think the interesting thing, there are a couple interesting things here. One is you point out the defense on the part of the Republicans, which was convoluted, perhaps flaccid. But, there was one effective moment where Jim Jordan and another Representative Carter, I believe it was, tried to establish that hearsay means that what you hear could be wrong.
Yes.
Sure. So that's just if you're doing legal defense in a court of law, that's a good way to cast doubt on a very important witness's testimony. So that's kudos for that. But I think mostly one of the problems they have is that it's not just that they're defending a practice that if it was done by any previous Democratic president, the Republicans themselves would be seeking the same remedy that the Democrats are seeking. I think the other problem is that this is all predicated on a specious conspiracy theory. And I hate to say that because I really hate what has happened to the term conspiracy theory in the Trump era. It has been completely mutated and weaponized in a way that I think the CIA could only have dreamt of in 1967 when they came up with a thing to try and throw sand into the gears of Garrison's investigation and its impact on the public. But they really want to the linchpin of what Trump was up to with Giuliani there, among other things, because I'm very focused on what Lev and Igor were doing to try and shake down Naftogaz and get their own guys put on the board of this state energy company that Rick Perry was involved in trying to do, because there's a big money shakedown happening there. But they really want to show that the election meddling of 2016 was not done by Russia, it was done by Ukraine. And that the server that CrowdStrike first determined showed this successful phishing attempt to hack the DNC was actually, it's a big phony baloney smokescreen that was concocted as a insurance policy just in case Trump were to win. What we can do with this phony baloney CrowdStrike server, which we have here in Ukraine, is to show that actually Russia and Donald Trump were secretly hacking the DNC to meddle in the election, and the only reason Donald Trump won is because of this meddling, and it's actually not meddling that was done by Russia, it was meddling that was done by the DNC and Hillary Clinton and the Ukrainians to frame Trump and Russia in the event that Trump should win, which is just about as wacky an idea as
Well, one problem with that is I had a friend call me
one
this.
problem.
Well, I had a friend call me this morning that I've known. He doesn't. I only talked to him like 6 months ago, but I used to know. 20 years ago, saw him every single day. He joined the military. He works in the Pentagon, but all his life, he literally listens to Rush Limbaugh every single day, and is a hardcore conservative. And he just happened to call me this morning, and he said, "What am I doing?" I said, "Well, I'm turning on this hearing. I'm going to watch it." And he sort of dismissed it and said, "Oh, it's all meaningless." Then he kind of goes, "Oh, we'll see what happens." But what I thought is this guy doesn't care at all what anything these people say, anything about the details. So from someone like his viewpoint, or a person that really likes Trump or thinks he's the leader of the conservative movement, they just don't care, and you're attacking them or their movement or whatever, and the details don't matter. But then on the flip side, this stuff you're talking about, the CrowdStrike and all these theories that they give their followers, the rest of the country doesn't care about that. You're not going to sell everyone else on this CrowdStrike stuff. So that is sort of like a thing about the whole topic and what politics has become. It's like the details don't matter, and it's just really almost maddening.
And I think that's such a great point, and it kind of segues to something I'm interested in talking about with you, which is, we've just had the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. And if you go back, and this is something you have a particular expertise on, But if you go back into the Cold War, one of the things that the Soviet Union was reputed to have done, and I think there's evidence it did do, often unsuccessfully, which is what I think is interesting, is try to co-opt radical movements inside the United States to sow discontent inside the body politic. It's just psychological warfare stuff that was going on during the Cold War, and trying to co-opt different movements and using things like the civil rights movement as a weapon or for geopolitical advantage in terms of trying to reach out to the third world and whatnot. But generally, I think that the Soviet Union's efforts to penetrate the United States were not really that effective, by and large. Now, I'm sure that there are some John Birchers who would disagree with me, and I'm sure you could point those people out, since that's one of your particular hobbies, is understanding, right-wing movements, particularly during the Cold War. But I am fascinated by the fact that 30 years after the Cold War ended, Berlin Wall fell, that right now we are probably in a period of informational Cold War that rivals or exceeds what was happening during the 60s and 70s in the United States, between the United States and Soviet Union. I mean, and I am absolutely impressed with the impact and the effect of the Russian intelligence services counterattack, because I think it's important to call it a counterattack, against the United States over the last 6 years. The effectiveness of it, the power of it, which may reflect internal fissures in the United States, which are more present now than were present even in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, that are easily exploitable or more easily exploitable, particularly in an age of surveillance capitalism and the internet.
Yeah, Larry Hancock, who's been a guest on Chuck Accelli's show several times, he wrote a book called Creating Chaos, which really does a really good job showing the history of the United States doing political warfare during the Cold War, but then showing the things that you're talking about with Russia doing this too. But honestly, as far as the Russians or the Soviet Union being effective at these things during the Cold War, I mean, the only real evidence I know of that is during World War II, they did have Americans who gave them intelligence about the atomic bomb.
Sure.
But after that, they really just a few isolated cases of kind of like misfit people in the intelligence agencies or whatever. But I don't really think they had much influence on the civil rights movement. And there were people that it's kind of funny as watching I'll give you an example. There was people in the United States that said they were communists, that were in the civil rights movement, and even in the South, and especially in the 40s and in the 1930s. But the labor movement had people inside of that were self-proclaimed communists, but they had no connection to the Soviet Union. And in fact, in 1978, there was a shooting. I just saw someone do an interview about this, but there's a shooting 50 miles away from me in Greensboro, North Carolina, where about 8 people were killed by the Ku Klux Klan, just shot during a march, and they were self-proclaimed communists and labor organizers. But I think this is all completely organic with no connection. And when Lyndon Johnson was president, there were all these riots and so forth taking place throughout urban America, Watts, Detroit, Baltimore, on and on and on, much bigger than people realize. and J. Edgar Hoover and him were trying to find evidence that this was connected to the Soviet Union or foreign powers. They couldn't find any.
No, and it really all started ironically with the debate in the State Department, because we're talking about the State Department now, over who lost China, which kind of set off the Red Scare and McCarthyism, the second Red Scare, because the first Red Scare was in the 1920s. Mm-hmm. And so I agree with you about that, about the ineffectiveness. Now, in the right-wing circles throughout the Cold War, there was always this feeling that the reason why the civil rights was happening was because it was a Soviet plot, which was a great way of trying to ignore the fact that it was actually because America's socio-political system was inherently racist. But one of the ironies, I think, is that throughout the Cold War, it was actually the United States that had a far more effective psychological warfare operation or set of operations. And those were often unleashed in other countries, places like Guatemala and all over South America, Iran with the overthrow of Mossadegh. So after the Cold War ends, the United States, I think, overplayed its hand by in a moment of triumphalism, by sending over Harvard economists, the Harvard boys led by Jeffrey Sachs, to go to the former Soviet Union, into Russia, initiate something called shock therapy, economic shock therapy, massive programs of austerity that actually, in a lot of ways, with these huge auctioning, with a lot of auctioning off, huge auctions of publicly owned assets, the United States economic shock therapy actually helped create the oligarchs in many ways, propped up Yeltsin, and I think, in my personal opinion, is that's where the seeds of everything that we are seeing were planted. That's where the grudge against the Clintons was first developed, because it was Bill Clinton who helped catalyze the economic shock therapy during the 90s on the Russian people. He propped up a drunken buffoon named Yeltsin. And in many ways, I think from the point of view of Russians, particularly people like Vladimir Putin, who ended up being in Yeltsin's government at the end after being a political figure in St. Petersburg, coming out of the KGB, was there at the end of Yeltsin when Yeltsin was engaged in a great deal of buffoonery, and it really sort of sowed the seeds of this, what became a counterattack. And of course, the United States under George W. Bush pushed even further. Not only did Clinton expand NATO, George W. Bush really expanded NATO after looking in Putin's eyes and seeing his soul. He finally realized, well, it's not the soul I thought it was. The color revolutions, one in Georgia that then was sort of a template for the color revolution under Victoria Nuland and Hillary Clinton during Obama in Ukraine, something that I've written about, and how big ag corporations in the United States had a huge interest in getting into Ukraine, which at one time was called the breadbasket of the Soviet Union, with its sort of loamy soil that is, considered some of the most productive soil on the planet. And so what I find interesting is that here's Russia now, after 30 years after this epic collapse of the Berlin Wall and the Soviet bloc, spending about $55 billion a year on defense. The United States spends, in all defense-related spending, about $1.2 to $1.3 trillion. And right now, he has Vladimir Putin, since sort of the high point of America's push on Russia, which would be the getting rid of Yanukovych and the Orange Revolution, the Color Revolution in Ukraine under Hillary Clinton and Victoria Nuland. Since that sort of high point of American encirclement, because remember, the United States also had military bases in a couple of the former stans. They had a military. They had They even had troops in Tajikistan, but they've got this huge Bagram air base in Afghanistan, is right on the southern border of Soviet Union. They've got massive troop installations in Japan and South Korea, excuse me. Now you've got NATO presence in the Baltic region. I mean, it's encirclement. From that, since that point to today, Vladimir Putin has taken back Crimea. He's got a chunk of Ukraine, Donbass. He's got a mercenary army in Libya. He has taken essentially control of Syria, has sold the S-400 missile system to Turkey, causing Turkey to basically, a key NATO ally, to be put in a very tenuous position with NATO, one in which they are now being not ejected, but their position in the F-35 program is in jeopardy, which is amazing because they actually build some of the components of the F-35, but they are not allowed to own or fly them now. And that F-35 program just saw a story today that's going to be the thin edge of the wedge in maybe denying the F-35 to some of the Gulf states, the F-35 being one of the most important military Keynesian programs that the Pentagon has ever constructed, and not just military Keynesianism inside the United States, but that kind of dollar diplomacy military Keynesianism in which you sell a major weapons system to overseas clients who then become enthralled to that weapon system in perpetuity, both financially and militarily. How about Venezuela? The United States tried to eject Maduro. No, he went and put some military advisors there, shut that down. I mean, he's now Putin is moving into Africa and is now starting to compete on some level, not extensively, but he just had a major summit in Sochi with African leaders. They had a very positive communique where African leaders were praising Vladimir Putin at Sochi. This happened about 6 weeks ago. If you don't watch the BBC, you would never know it. He is drilling for oil in the Arctic cooperatively with China. It's really amazing, Mike. I mean, you know history and you know geopolitics. I've said this to other people. It hasn't registered because they're not nerds about this stuff. But this is like Metternich level geopolitical mastery.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you World War II, the English Empire had a policy of balance of powers. So whoever was the strongest power rising in Europe, they would support the other side. And to make it, explain it really simple, and after World War II, NATO was the one power for the west of Europe. So all these countries were integrated in NATO, and in theory would all work together if there was a conflict. And the U.S. had forces in all of them. And then once the Cold War is over, as you said, they expanded NATO after having said they wouldn't. And there's a video I remember seeing on YouTube a couple years ago where Senator Bill Bradley is giving a talk and says, this is the worst mistake ever made, basically. And Putin has successfully reacted to that. And if you look at it now, he's not doing a balance of power strategy. Instead, I would say he's doing a strategy of let's not balance the powers out, but try to make as many as we can, at least in Europe. So, like you said, Turkey is a member of NATO, but the relations are fraying. And then, Austria, Hungary, Romania, other states are becoming more nationalistic, going on their own. And even Germany itself, there's a bunch of articles last week about the fall of the Berlin Wall all over the place. And one of them, I think it was in the Washington Post, might have been the Times, but whatever, was talking about the people in Germany, living in Eastern Germany, don't feel united with the rest of the country, and they feel left behind and looked down upon. And also, they're turning. Some of them are more anti-immigrant than the rest of the country. As a result, they feel like they're losing their culture and all kinds of different stuff. So the biggest threat that Russia has ever faced besides NATO is Germany, and whether they're involved in that or not, Germany is less united.
It's hard. This gets to that squishy thing about Russian meddling. You don't want to blame Russia for everything. Now, in terms of East Germany, that's where the AfD is having its most impact. It's getting its most traction. That's Alternative for Germany. It's not AFG because it's Alternative for Deutschland, but the AfD is having a huge impact there. And if you look throughout all of the industrialized world, putting aside Japan, although Japan has had off and on its issues with nationalism, which is something that I have a particular expertise in, but it's not going through the same thing now, because I think I look at Japan as the leading indicator for the future of industrialized economies. I think Japan, we are entering our secular stagnation period, and the way that we're dealing with secular stagnation is through nonstop quantitative easing, right? Which is what Japan tried to do too, but our market, I think, is more dynamic and more easily manipulated than the Japanese market was, the Nikkei was in, say, the 90s when secular stagnation took hold. But you look at Japan in terms of falling birth rates, lack of sexual interest among young people, aging population, the need for immigrant labor to fill gaps. All of these things, Japan is this leading indicator, because I think what you find in all of these industrialized economies is they all start to mirror the same problems. When you have a certain level of wealth creation that brings up standard of living to a certain point, there you start to have other factors that enter into the socioeconomic dynamic, and one of them is kind of a malaise that takes over, and that goes along with secular stagnation. And I think that one of the antidotes to that malaise, which often, by the way, goes along with the fact that these advanced economies, these heavily industrialized or heading into post-industrial economies, I guess almost at this point, is that there are these fissures around things like immigration, because these economies, with their declining birth rates, actually do need immigration to make up for labor forces. It was one of the things in Japan, for example. They have a large aging population, and one of the ways that they're dealing with the fact that they need a lot of caregivers is they're importing nurses from the Philippines. People don't know this. One of the Philippines' most successful exports, nurses. Lots of nurses come out of the Philippines. A survey, I think it was by Asahi Shimbun, this was about 19 months ago when I was working on a thing about robotics and robot switchover, was that that Japanese who were surveyed would prefer to have a robot nurse over a Filipina or a Filipino. Yes.
That's weird.
But that's a reflection of a long-standing racial issue that Japan has been a heavily racialist or racist, depending on your point of view, country going way, way back. And so their desire to not have immigrants come into their country is motivating their desire to have robots treat them over human beings, which is one of the reasons why Japan is is leading on robot production, because they don't want to import immigrant labor into Japan. They want to keep homogeneity and cultural and racial purity. And this is, again, one of the issues that you find in Germany. You're finding it in France. You're finding it in Britain. People, if you didn't dive deep into Brexit, one of the wedge issues in the Brexit vote was Polish workers. there were Brits, particularly in the north of Britain, in the places like, around Manchester, the old industrial north, and also in the countryside, where they were reacting against the incursion of Poles who were coming through Schengen, which is the ability to travel throughout the EU and work, to work in Britain against Poles. So in the United States, we're seeing it as well. So this is something that is reflected throughout all of these industrialized economies, and something that I think it just in a fascinating bit of historical symmetry, something that the Soviet Union was ineffective at doing in the Cold War, which is to argue against the injustices of capitalism inside capitalist countries, to try and undermine those countries, divide those countries, and create some kind of chaos and so political chaos inside those countries, did not work throughout the Cold War, but it is working today. Now that communism has left the stage, though, that same core ideological wedge issue is being used today, and to far greater effect than it ever was during the Cold War.
Well, maybe part of it could be because communism, such as represented by the Soviet Union, is this very specific ideology. You can go read Karl Marx if you want, but it's got an idea, communism and a program to it. Whereas this right-wing nationalism really does not have one specific program. It's a mishmash of various ideas. So I can be against anti-immigration, but does that mean I subscribe to all these other things? Maybe not, but I might subscribe to 20 of them and not be able to link them all together.
Right, and because it's realpolitik, right? It's political realism on the geopolitical stage. A great example of that is part of the allegiance of what we could broadly call Trumpism to, not allegiance, affinity is a much better word. Let's say affinity for Vladimir Putin's Russia is that Vladimir Putin is seen as a champion of traditional Christianity. Now, why is he a champion of traditional Christianity? It's because he has re-elevated the Orthodox Church to a position, a prominent position in Russian social, cultural, and political life. Now, is it because Vladimir Putin is himself a devout follower of the Orthodox Church? I don't think so. I think it's because he knows that he knew when he started to do this, the middle of the last of the aughts. Can you believe it? The last decade. We're talking about we're like in our second decade of the 21st century, Mike. It still blows my mind.
Crazy.
It is crazy. So this coincided a bit with his rise to power, which was cemented by the Chechen War and the Moscow apartment bombings, which have been proven to have been an inside job. There was a time. This is another maddening thing. Many of the, particularly on the left, many of the progressives who are critics of Russiagate and Ukrainegate, and many of the libertarians who are critics of Russiagate and Ukrainegate, I could go back in time to 2001, 2002, 2003, and they were all looking at Vladimir Putin as sort of the master of the false flag attack. And there was an amazing article in the New York Review of Books on the Moscow apartment bombings, where they've actually got former KGB, currently GRU guys in one of, they got pictures of the guys putting bombs in cars. I mean, it's like they got it. But that war and the framing of the Chechens and the framing of the Muslim threat coincided with the elevation of the re-elevation of the Russian Orthodox Church. And I think Vladimir Putin and the people around him knew that what Russia was missing was an identity around which they could be organized. And so organizing people around identities, regardless of whether or not you believe in the ideology around the identity, is is tactically and strategically smart in a country that is trying to reassert itself, which, by the way, in my theory of fascism, which I wrote as a graduate student, that's how I got my master's degree, it's just a piece called Axis Studies, a critical reevaluation of the historiography of fascism. And what I did is I compared Germany, Japan, and Italy, and the one thing that they all shared was between 1868 and 1871, they were all brand new nation states. Previously, they had been particularist, pseudo-national entities in which, in Germany, a Bavarian thought of themselves as a Bavarian before they ever thought of themselves as a German. A Prussian thought of themselves as a Prussian. In Italy, if you were from Piedmont, you were a Piedmontese. If you were from Naples, you were a Napolitan. In Japan, it was actually the same thing. Before the Meiji Restoration, which was the restoration of the Central Imperial House, Japan was tied up in a bunch of local, they were called daimyos, and they were local sort of mini shogunates. And the two main houses, Choshu and Satsuma, they ended up coming together to re-elevate the imperial house under the Meiji Restoration. And Choshu and Satsuma, actually, one of them became the navy and the other became the army. And so these three countries arrived to the nation state game in the late, so let's just say 1868 to 1871, so let's just say 1870. They all arrived at the same time. The other European powers had carved up the world, the age of colonialism. They were all carving up Africa. The United States was pushing all over the world as well. One of the things that catalyzed the Meiji Restoration was the arrival of Perry's Great White Fleet to Japan, and they all had to come up with a national identity that could unite a particularist people that did not have any allegiance to a central governing idea or identity. They all had to come up with something, and I don't think it's coincidental. As a matter of fact, I wrote that it's not coincidental that they eventually all became the vanguard fascist powers in the 1930s. So developing a national identity that can unify people is an incredibly effective tool. And oh, by the way, the United States did it too. If I were to go on to a PhD, my PhD thesis would be on Teddy Roosevelt as America's first fascist, because the winning of the West and the westward push, which became one of the most enduring mythologies of American life, which is the winning of the West and cowboys and the Western movement of the United States after the Civil War, was the way in which the United States generated a national identity after a major particularist civil conflict.
And so that's how it put the pieces back together again.
And Teddy Roosevelt's the guy who did it. You go west, young man. And I think it's one of the reasons why California in particular became such a beacon for the new identity of America in the 20th century. And by the end of the 20th century, I think you could very easily argue that California becomes actually the world's idea of what America is, and it's not coincidental.
Well, I feel out of, like, in some ways that I don't know everything that's going on with our culture. So about this kind of stuff, because I was just reading a book about the Vietnam War written by a veteran who was, I guess he was against the war, but anyway, he goes, it's supposed to be a book about the Vietnam War, and the first two chapters, he's talking, all of it is about music and rock and roll music and how this was he argues the entire culture of the 50s that he grew up in was about driving in your car and the music of the time, and he lists all the bands, and Elvis and on and on and on. And then he says we had an optimistic spirit, we had the bomb over our heads and things on television, the civil rights disturbances and stuff. But he claims Kennedy represented the youth and optimism that we were all feeling. And then after he was killed, that was transferred completely 100% to this rock and roll music that he talks about. And I grew up liking this music myself, but not feeling that I was part of some vanguard movement by liking it. It was just already there. But it makes me wonder, like today, what in the world, if his argument's correct, that generation was really inspired by this music, and it carried over into their protests against the Vietnam War and on and on and on. What is, what is going on in our culture that inspires people or anything? It's just like a mess. But then I'm like, am I just out of touch? I don't know what's going on.
No, I don't think so. I think that is ironic. There's another one of those ironies. It's our national identity, I think, throughout the Cold War was in part ensconced in our juxtaposition to the Soviet Union.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually think that people think that the Soviet Union collapsed in 1989 and America triumphed, but I think America began to collapse when the Soviet Union collapsed. And I think that organizing principle, and in a way, the Soviet Union provided a juxtaposition and a check and balance on American life. And it created a purpose, an other against which the United States could claim some kind of moral high ground, whether real or illusory, and was a unifying principle. Remember Mike, remember the heady days? Foreign policy, politics ends at the water's edge. Foreign policy is apolitical. Remember those days? It's a long time ago. So one of the other interesting things, though, is, and obvious, is the way technology has atomized us.
Oh yeah.
Because you bring up music, and I say this, I got a 25-year-old, and he never experienced, or he barely experienced, the end of a time when we were all participating in the same popular culture together.
Mm-hmm.
You go back to, I love to do this on Sirius satellite radio. On the 70s station, they play America's Top 40. They just run through the weeks. So I don't know where they are now, like in 1973. And you listen to America's Top 40 from 1973 or 76 or something. One, you probably had 50 million people listening to that broadcast on a Saturday morning. All of America was listening to Casey Kasem. That's one. Two, if you listen to the songs, they're from every genre. All the genres are generally represented from 1 to 40. You're going to find just a potpourri of different music, but everybody was participating in it. Just like everybody participated in watching All in the Family or the final episode of MASH, where it was like a 60 share. That means 60% of all the televisions in America were watching the same thing at the same time. You think about the news broadcasts and Cronkite getting a 25 share, and then the other two news networks were picking up the rest. I mean, that's gone. And I think as we have become more atomized, this is where surveillance capitalism and the new politics comes in, because with micro-targeting and all of the excess behavioral data, they call it it's called behavioral surplus. All of the behavioral surplus data that's picked up by all of our interactions now with tech, particularly through our phones and apps, Facebook, Google, all of that surplus data is allowing for, it's basically like Bernays' dream come true, where our decision-making processes are becoming ever more predictable to the people who are collating all of the behavioral data that we are forking over for free. And I think what that means is that we could feel more individually empowered than ever before, when actually we are more controlled than ever before, because our interactions with each other through technology are such that it feels like we are part of something, but actually, because everything is now moving towards micro-targeting, we can be manipulated on a level that makes us feel part of a whole, when actually we are a completely individual unit that is being corralled into larger aggregate um, goals. We are being moved towards goals that we feel we are choosing when actually we are choosing those less and less because our behavioral data is making us ever more predictable, and they can feed us the decisions that we are going to make before we are ever going to make them.
Well, people compare Bill Gates or Zuckerberg to the robber barons of the 1800s, but those people, if you think about what they were doing, the industrialists were making profits from people's labor working in factories.
Right.
And the worst examples, the most exploitive of them would be using child labor or the situations in coal mines and so forth. Sure. But the labor movement, changed that a little bit. But now, the factories are gone for the most part, and Trump campaigned on bringing back manufacturing, which everyone knows really isn't going to happen.
Nope.
However, the capitalism of back then was about producing things, and I would use, maybe exploiting sounds crude, like it turns people off to use a phrase like that because it sounds like Marxism or something, but they're using the profit of other people's labor in these factories, whereas today something like Facebook or Google, they're not doing that. I'm not working for them. However, they are profiting off all of us, but not our labor like someone working in a factory. It's more like they just are profiting off the fact that we're alive and or
no, they're monetizing our personalities now.
Yeah, they're our existence. That's what it is.
So this is so
which is creepier in a way. It's
way
different.
Creepier, and the implications are, I think, staggering.
Like let me put you this way: the robber barons of the past, the worst version would be exploiting a child, back breaking labor, working on a chain gang or something. But it's physical labor. This is more like they're exploiting your soul or something.
Well, they're exploiting your personality and the data that you produce by simply being. And the difference is that exploitation of that child is an apparent exploitation to anybody who views it from the outside. That is, it's a quantifiable exploitation. The perniciousness of surveillance capitalism is that we feel we are being freed at the time we are being enslaved. The exploitation is far more discreet in surveillance capitalism, to the extent to which it doesn't feel like you're being exploited, because their practices are hidden behind walls of proprietary claims, of algorithms that are proprietary to them and they can't reveal it, much like fracking fluid cocktails, right? So we can't necessarily see the ways we are being exploited, and the way our environment is populated with the outcomes of that exploitation gives us the illusion of choice, because we have been acclimated to believe that exercising consumerism is the ultimate exercising of one's freedom, because freedom is choosing between 17 types of cereal. One of my favorite things of all time is after 9/11, when America was on its freedom binge, freedom fries and everything was freedom, freedom, freedom. I noticed that the local Safeway had changed the frozen food aisle to frozen choices. I thought, wow, that's great. Frozen choices. That's right. Frozen choices, which I think is a double entendre in a funny kind of way, because if we think that freedom, the freedom to choose a different kind of frozen apple pie, we've lost the plot on freedom. And this really gets back to the malaise of industrialized economies that I think Vladimir Putin has exploited, and China is exploiting, and everybody's exploiting. And politically, I think that Brad Parscale and the Trump campaign are exploiting it. And it's that, and this kind of ultra late stage capitalism where we've kind of run the table on financialization. Is there anything else that can be financialized at this point, Michael? I mean, we're the economy of actual things is a quaint aspect of a much of the GDP at this point. You know what I mean? It's like most of the economy is financial transactions and game playing and whatnot. And so what is there left for capitalism to monetize but our personalities?
Yeah, that's where we're at. I mean, the stock market, when I first got interested in that over 20 years ago now, you'd buy books about picking out stocks that are going to increase their earnings and stuff like that. Now people just trade tweets. It just promises that there's going to be a trade deal or something, and that's all right. They talk. That's what they talk about on the financial news. It's
literally market psychology is what's being monetized, the psychology of the market, not the performance of it per se. So this is what I think is interesting about the politics now. And it's, ostensibly you could say that the pioneer in using social media for politics was the Obama campaign, Pluff and Axelrod, and they used text messaging in particular on phones to try to organize young people, and it was very effective at that time. And they had a decent young turnout for young voters, considering how young voters generally underperform. So, but it was nothing like what was done in 2016. I think Cambridge Analytica was way more effective than anybody wants to admit, and particularly Cambridge Analytica wanted to admit before it changed into another company. It was dissolved and changed. But I look at Psy Group, which was the company that the Mohammed bin Salman and Mohammed bin Zayed went to a Trump Tower meeting and pitched to Don Jr., we want to use Psy Group to help your father win the campaign. That's in my mega piece, which you were one of the few people who read. I appreciate it. Thank you. And what we have now is an environment in which this kind of psychological surveillance capitalism, psychological data, behavioral surplus, surveillance capitalism politics means that on a precinct by precinct level, individual voters can be targeted with specific messages that make them feel like they're part of a large movement, that everybody thinks the way they do, but actually they can be micro-targeted with modulated messages which don't necessarily reflect the same messages that are being sent to other voters in the coalition that's being built to win a minority election and turn an electoral college with something like 44% of the vote. I think we are heading to a point at which you can see people win the electoral college with aggregate numbers between 42 and 44% of the total vote. And that could be done by not just turning out your voters, but by turning off your opponent's voters and using micro-targeting not to motivate your people, but to disincentivize voting for your opponent and to fracture the vote among even third-party candidates as needed. And so this level of, look, for example, why did Brad Parscale, who is Trump's campaign manager, who uses America First PAC as a slush fund? By the way, Igor and Lev gave him $325,000 at America First PAC. I would like to know what did he do with that money? But anyway, so why did they sell plastic straws? Is it because they wanted to own the libs, or is it because they wanted to identify a new subset of voters that could be motivated to vote as environmental refuseniks who want to thumb their nose at the idea of giving up convenience in favor of an environmental goal? And now that they've sold those straws to those people, they have the data on those people, and now they can micro-target messages to them through social media and directly through email and on through Twitter, their Twitter profile, through Facebook, and get them to vote on that single issue and put that in with a matrix of other data they have and start to come up with predictable outcomes for their behavior based on how that data set interacts with their other data sets. So this is why I think it's interesting that Trump continues his outreach with black Americans. Why is he continuing to do that? Had the Blacks for Trump rally last week and everything. And this is why I think Kanye is actually going to play a role in the next election. You don't need to win a significant number of African American votes to have African American votes have a significant impact on an election now. If you can pick 5 precincts in South Carolina where you need to have African American turnout underperform the last election by 2%, you may be able to, if you do your number crunching, win South Carolina by 7,000 votes, and that's all you need, and you can win the election. I think it's at that level now where we're talking about winning states by 3 to 12,000 votes, and that's all you need to do. You don't need to have a universal message that you're selling as a campaign to call out large aggregate numbers to try and win a significant election victory, because who cares about mandates anymore anyway? Because all you have to do is win, and you just call it a mandate. Now that we're in this post-truth environment, you can call anything you want, and it doesn't matter as long as you hit it hard enough with your marketing pitch. Who cares? Call it whatever you want. Call it a mandate. So we're in an environment now where this thing that you mentioned earlier, which is we don't have a group identity similar to what we had in the 50s, 60s. We don't have a America's Top 40 culture. We have I download my own playlist on my own personal device and listen to what I want to listen to from my Pandora station that I designed myself. That's the environment that the political system is starting to react to, and for good or for ill, the innovator of that is Donald Trump's campaign, which I believe picked up its cues from Cambridge Analytica, and Cambridge Analytica was itself a crossover point for Russian psychological warfare and Israeli psychological warfare techniques.
Well, no, I got to let you go in a minute. But one last question I'll ask you, maybe to wrap it up. You mentioned the rise of the fascist powers, Japan, Italy, Germany, and I'll just talk about Germany, but because I know they used radio as a new technology radio was new in the 1920s as a mass technology, and it was used to mobilize the population around the Nazi Party, or at least enough of the population, 40-50%, to win elections. And I assume the other 2 countries also had some unifying message for everybody.
Absolutely.
That changed the culture. Yep. And America at different times had unifying messages. But what about today? I mean, how can you, if Trump is a nationalist, how do you be a nationalist in a country that's multicultural and all split up and disfangled now?
It's exactly through surveillance capitalism techniques where you micro-target those people to create the electoral wedge you need with very slim margins to carry the Electoral College and continue to win elections with a minority. So I think we're in sort of a perpetual minority government situation now, at least as long as surveillance capitalism's techniques remain dominant inside political campaigns. Now, in 2018, the Democrats had a pretty effective national message that played in the suburbs, which was really mostly about healthcare. I mean, that election was won on healthcare. That was the number one issue that tied together. And so healthcare may be the one thing that can transcend this weird atomization process that surveillance capitalism does, which is basically puts us all into our own little individual matrix pods connected to a central messaging system that can feed us the reality we need to stay on board with the needs of the central messaging system. I think it's up for debate right now. I think this next election is going to hash out some of these questions. Will the Trump campaign be able to replicate that micro-targeting technique to effect and win what is likely to be another election in which he loses the aggregate popular vote but wins the electoral college? And Michael, we're just starting to get our heads around what surveillance capitalism really is, and there was an amazing interview on Harry Shearer's Le Show 2 weekends ago where he interviewed Shoshana Zuboff, who wrote a book on surveillance capitalism. I highly recommend listening to it. I've posted it on Twitter, and I'll send it to you off air if you want to listen to it.
Yeah, I want to listen to that.
And you will want to listen to it and post it. But this is an inflection point.
Well, last Saturday, I drove 15 miles somewhere to a park and took a walk, okay? And I bought these things from a company called the Teaching Company. They're supposed to be college courses, right? And I have a pile of them. I bought them a long time ago. So I started listening to one about addiction by some psychologist. And so I was listening to a 30-minute lecture about alcoholism. And this was like in the afternoon, then I get home, I didn't use my computer at all. And then the next morning I was using the internet and I saw advertisements for fatty liver disease and courses about this or that. And I'm not looking this stuff. I haven't looked that stuff up anywhere, except listen to this thing going down the card. I'm not thinking I'm going to, want any of these products or need them. There's my phone, I guess, spied on me and told them,
the
that
data pull is happening all the time. All the time. It is not stopping. I mean, this is, I don't have an Alexa. I will never have a Google Home or Alexa around me, but I do have a smartphone. And I have to tell you, I've actually come to the point at which I'm starting to think about I dropped my phone, I cracked the screen. It's still functioning, it's fine. But I'm thinking, do I want to buy another smartphone or am I going to buy a flip phone? I might actually go back to a flip phone just to be able to have a phone and something I can get a text message on. But I don't want Google Android operating system monitoring my every move and everything I do. And I've resisted Google as much as I possibly can. I do not use Google. I've never used Google Chrome. I use Opera, which I recommend. I don't even use Google Search anymore. I use DuckDuckGo. But good luck. I mean, we are in a surveillance matrix all the time, and this is something that we are not really coping with. But what we are doing is dealing with the impact of it. And I think the political environment that we see right now is itself catalyzed by the intersection of surveillance capitalism with political manipulation.
And we're just only now wrapping our heads around that it's happened, and it's been going on for a while, most likely. But well, thanks for taking your time to talk with me and my listeners, and have a good rest of the week.
All right, take care.